Good morning. As you heard, this is my first talk. So I want to start by saying that I have the utmost gratitude to the Sangha here at IBMC for giving me this opportunity. I don't take it lightly. And I also thank all of you for being here. It's a little cooler today, but it's been a pretty warm month. So thank you for braving the heat. Good thing about giving your first Dharma talk in the summer is that if you start sweating from nervousness, you can blame it on the heat. So I think I have that saving grace today. When I knew I'd be giving this talk, I wanted to try to cram pretty much everything into it. Like, if this is the only talk I ever give, like, what can I really get at? And so I started thinking about, well, the path itself, the Eightfold Path. But I also wanted to do something slightly different, not just go over all the points of it, but to also see what the Buddha has to say about the Eightfold Path. And so I happened to be reading through the Dhammapada, and there's a part in it, it's the 20th chapter of the Dhammapada, on the path. And so I decided to formulate the talk around that. And, I'm very interested in this because, when I first started delving into Buddhism and meditation, I was mostly interested in the meditation part. And I really didn't think about it so much as a holistic path that changes the way you think, the way you speak, the way you act, and it's not just something you do to feel good sitting on a cushion. Like, it can be that, but it can also be so much more. And so that's why sharing an excerpt from the Dhammapada is so important, because we get to look at the words of the Buddha. We get to look at the Dhamma as he intended it to be taught. And it's one of those things where we look at society today, and the Dhamma has never been more accessible, yet so often more ignored, I think sometimes, where we really focus on meditation and not the other things that we could be doing. So the Dhammapada, if you don't know, is a collection of verses, sayings that the Buddha said throughout the course of his teaching, compiled into themes. And so you see themes on, like, pears, I believe is where it starts off, and goes on to things like, the sage, the enlightened one, and the one I'm going to be talking about today, the path. Now, the translation I'm using, I managed to find for free on a website called Sutta Central, so if you're interested in finding it, please do so. I like this translation a lot. The translator of this one is Venerable Acharya Buddharakkhita, who was the founder of the Mahabodhi Society, which I found was a really cool coincidence, because a couple months ago we had Venerable Ananda speak here, who was ordained by this teacher in, like, 1984. So kind of this thing that I only found out on Friday that I thought was really, really cool. So what I would like to do with this translation is read it once all the way through for you guys, and so you get to hear the full weight of all the verses. And then what I would like to do is provide commentary. Some of it is my own. Some comes from the great scholar Buddhaghosa, who also put together a commentary on the Dhammapada. And so again, these verses in the Theravada tradition are believed to be verses that he gave to various people in various circumstances to different audiences. And so there are a couple points where I find it's helpful to look at those commentaries and see who the audience was, and I think it helps uncover what he meant. So I think now I'll go ahead and start with the verses. So this is again from the Dhammapada. These are verses 273 to 289, and they begin as such. Of all the paths, the Eightfold Path is the best. Of all the truths, the Four Noble Truths are the best. Of all things, passionlessness is the best. Of men, the Seeing One, the Buddha, is the best. This is the only path. There is none other for the purification of insight. Tread this path, and you will bewilder Mara. Walking upon this path, you will make an end of suffering. Having discovered how to pull out the thorn of lust, I make known the path. You yourselves must strive. The Buddhas only point the way. Those meditative ones who tread the path are released from the bonds of Mara. All conditioned things are impermanent. When one sees this with wisdom, one turns away from suffering. This is the path to purification. All conditioned things are unsatisfactory. When one sees this with wisdom, one turns away from suffering. This is the path to purification. All things are not self. When one sees this with wisdom, one turns away from suffering. This is the path to purification. The idler, who does not exert himself when he should, who though young and strong is full of sloth, with a mind full of vain thoughts, such an indolent one does not find the path to wisdom. Let a man be watchful of speech, well controlled in mind, and not commit evil in bodily action. Let him purify these three courses of action, and win the path made known by the great sage. Wisdom springs from meditation. Without meditation, wisdom wanes. Having known these two paths of progress and decline, let a man so conduct himself that his wisdom may increase. Cut down the forest, lust, but not the tree. From the forest springs fear. Having cut down the forest and the underbrush, desire, be passionless, O monks. For so long as the underbrush of desire, even the most subtle, of a man towards a woman is not cut down, his mind is in bondage, like the sucking calf to its mother. Cut off your affection in the manner of a man who plucks with his hand an autumn lotus. Cultivate only the path to peace, nibbana, as made known by the Exalted One. Here shall I live during the rains, here in winter and summer. Thus thinks the fool. He does not realize the danger that death might intervene. As a great flood carries away a sleeping village, so death seizes and carries away the man with a clinging mind, doting on his children and cattle. For him who is assailed by death, there is no protection by kinsmen. None there are to save him, no sons, nor father, nor relatives. Realizing this fact, let the wise man, restrained by morality, hasten to clear the path leading to nibbana. So I'll begin by looking at the very first verses. When the Buddha talks about the Eightfold Path being the best path, the Four Noble Truths being the best truths. They're not the best only because the Buddha said so, right? He was a very practical teacher, and so there's a standard by which he thinks of the term best. Okay, the Four Noble Truths all deal with suffering, right? So the first truth itself is dukkha, that suffering exists in this world of samsara, this world of rebirth, right? Where desire is this thing, we're thirsty creatures. And then there's the truth of samudaya, right? That this dukkha, this arises in a certain way. And then the third, nirodha, that there's a way for it to secede, that it can fade away, burn away. And then the fourth noble truth itself is the Eightfold Path. Now, the reason why those truths are the best truths for the Buddha is not because they're the only ones. If you read the book In the Buddha's Words by Venerable Dr. Rahula, right? He recounts a story of the Buddha being in a forest with some monks, and he gathers some leaves in his hands. And he asks his monks, okay, where do you think the most leaves reside? In my hand or in the trees? And the monks look at the Buddha and they say, well, the trees. I mean, clearly there's a lot more leaves there. And he goes, well, that's the same way with truth. A lot of truths out there. These are the truths that I've shared with you. The ones that he found to be the most applicable to our lives. There can be many truths out there, and in the Buddha's time, there were a lot of philosophers trying to figure out, how old the universe is. Does it have a beginning? Does it have an end? Is it eternal? Does man have a soul? And if the soul exists, is that eternal? Does that have an end? And people were trying to uncover all of these things. And he said, well, those are all the realm of opinion. We can talk about those things. We can debate endlessly on them. But these are the ones we can do something about. So even further down, when he says, this is the only path, this isn't meant to be sectarian, to cut lines, not this way, in this one. He again is talking about the beliefs, religions, philosophies of his own time, in which you had people very materialistic. You had very wealthy people, very poor people, and they all believed that the best way to happiness is being wealthy, having acquisition of goods, being powerful, being rulers. There were a lot of warriors and kings taking over territories, and so they saw themselves as being very happy. And yet, the Buddha himself came out of that, and he was not, and many others have not when they've had a lot of wealth. And then you had the other side of that, these ascetics who would give up everything and torture their bodies in excruciating ways, thinking that that would lead to some kind of eternal happiness or salvation or liberation, and it didn't seem to, at least not to the Buddha, right? And so we talk about the middle way as something not in either extreme. It is not fully materialistic. It isn't fully, eschewing the body and causing it harm. It's living in balance. And more importantly, it's a focus inward on the mind. A lot of other paths we find deal not with what we can do internally, but they look at happiness and liberation externally, right? There's some ritual we can do. There's some prayer we can pray. There's some incense we can light. There's some, divine figure maybe that can do the work for us. And so I believe that is an empowering statement when he says this is the only path, because he's saying that the only way to find liberation is through our own efforts. And so the Eightfold Path is a mental and individual activity. No one can do it for you, right? So that when he says it's the only way, that means that the only way to find our own liberation is through having our right understanding and right thought and right speech, right action, right livelihood, right effort, right mindfulness and concentration, right? These are things that we control, that we can do. No one else can do it for us. And so he says that himself. You yourselves must strive. The Buddhas only point the way. And so there's a very famous example the Buddha gives of a raft, right? That the raft is the Dhamma that we use to get to the other side, where it's safer, where we can be at peace. And the raft is often seen as those are the Buddha's teachings. But when you think about situations where you need to build yourself a raft, like that's something you've got to do. Like if someone's providing a boat, there's a ship, they'll bring you along the way. That's someone doing something for you. So I like to think of that example being more like there's some instructions posted on a tree maybe on how to build a raft, and then you got to do it. You got to figure out, this is Survivor, you got to learn how to make rope and stuff on an island or something. You got to twine that together and cut down the logs. You got to fell the trees. You have to make that raft yourself to get yourself to the other side. And then once you're on the other side, this thing that you've put all this effort into, your whole life building it, you got to just let it go too. All right, that's something else that you have to let go of, because we have this statement here that the passionlessness is best, to be unattached. So even in the end, we have to still be unattached to even the Dhamma, even the work we do in this life to become free, liberated. And so we see here too that the Buddha also talks about impermanence and unsatisfactoriness as well, and he uses particular words for those statements, conditioned things. And when we talk about these marks of existence, impermanence, ultimate unsatisfactoriness, not self, when we talk about those things, those first two only apply to the things that exist in this realm, the realm of samsara. Those things are conditioned. And when he talks about not self, he uses not sankhara, I believe is the word he uses for that, which means conditioned things. He uses dhammas in that example. So that means that no self is something that applies not only to conditioned things, but also the unconditioned, which means nibbana. So the entire time you're felling the trees, making the rope, building the raft, you're nobody, and then you get across the shore, and then you really know you're nobody. And so that's the lesson we take away from that. And to get more to that point about these efforts that we need to exert, these things that we must do, he points to the idler, right? And so in this point, I will talk about the commentaries here. according to the Theravada tradition, when the Buddha said that line, and this one is verse 280, the idler who does not exert himself when he should, he was talking about a particular monk who had a lot of friends who were making great gains one day in their meditation. And they had specifically asked the Buddha, like, oh, well, we're going to do walking meditation. What kind of meditation should we do to get the most insight into reality? And so the Buddha gives them instructions, and this one monk heard it as well. And they go off into the woods during the day to do their walking meditation, and they come back, and man, it worked. They really figured some stuff out. And then this monk, after spending a whole day sort of just hanging out, doing his own thing, he goes, oh, no, I should go too. And he runs off into the woods at night to do this walking meditation, and trips and breaks his leg very badly, right? And so that's luck, karma, one of those things happening there. But the takeaway that we can have is that life throws us all sorts of things. We never really know what to expect, right? Which means that this is the moment to start. This is the moment to work on our liberation. That it's not something to put off and wait for, because we might trip and fall. We might, who knows, hit our head, go into a coma, and as we'll see or as we've already heard in some of the other verses, we might just up and die. And our thoughts, because mind is so important in Buddhism, really matter in the end as well. If we ascribe to the concept of rebirth, then that means that whatever final thought we have as we're dying, that's going to be the first thought in the next life. And so if you have an untrained mind and you've never really worked on yourself to work on the Brahma Viharas, you never worked on loving kindness or equanimity, things like that, then who knows what that final thought might be like and where it might lead. So best to start now, right? Wherever we're at, we all start at various points. I started mostly being a meditator and thinking that weirdly that Buddhist meditation will help me find God. And Buddha said a lot of things about meditation. He didn't say that. And so I blame that on my preconceived notions of what spirituality was supposed to do. I had a Catholic upbringing, and I was very, very much a perennialist who thought that it's all pretty much the same, right? And kind of cherry-picked a lot of different things with very mixed results. But when we start focusing on this path, which is much more than meditation, we begin to see that we really have so much more agency than we realize. Once we start waking up to the fact that this world outside of this body we can't really control, but a lot more we can do here. And I think about the Buddha as he was working on this enlightenment for himself. He was doing things to make that happen. He was looking at his mind and his body, applying mindfulness, applying skillfulness, looking at the consequences of his actions and seeing what had the best results for himself and others to alleviate suffering, right? And as we do that of our own will, of our own volition, we find that, we are a little happier, a little more at ease, even if the world itself is not, because of course this is still samsara, and we can try to change it up to a point, but suffering always applies. Let's see. So in 281, the Buddha says, "Let a man be watchful of speech, well controlled in mind, and not commit evil in bodily action. Let him purify these three courses of action and win the path made known by the great sage." So we find this both within the Noble Eightfold Path in, right thought, right speech, right action, and of course, right livelihood comes out of that as well. But we also find that in the 5 precepts, which are meant to make sure that as we're working on our skillfulness, as we're working on our liberation, we still can be pretty decent human beings who are causing as little harm as possible. And so that's something that if you're only focusing on meditation, you might not get around to it, especially if early on I was really caught up in the pleasurable states that come from meditation. I was actually probably getting into some of the jhanas without even realizing that's what I was doing, and so I would be really blissed out on the cushion and then get up, and I'd still be pretty much the same guy I was when I sat down, which, varying levels of skillfulness there. But when we start applying the 5 precepts, then no matter what, we're at least not causing harm. And then as we become more skillful in that, we can start maybe even promoting, healing for others, promoting health for others, happiness for others, rather. And that only comes with the kind of diligence that we find in mindfulness, right? When we start really looking at our lives. And so that's why I keep talking about this as being a mental practice, even though there are so many outward applications, right? Because we do affect each other's lives. I mean, that's interconnectedness right there. And so even if you are working on your own mind, you end up working on pretty much everything else too, but more skillfully because you started with your mind. So we see here that wisdom springs from meditation. Without meditation, wisdom wanes. And so again, this is why mindfulness, even applied to the jhanas, even applied to those kind of very concentrated forms of meditation, is so helpful. My own experience with that is that you can be really blissed out, but if you're not paying attention to what happens through that process, you might not see the impermanence of reality. You might not see its unsatisfactoriness. You might not see the lack of self there, and you might not see how you interact with the world. You're just really happy there, and then when you go outside, at least what I found after these really blissful states is that the world seemed even harsher to me, because I'd been filled with so much joy and pleasure and peace, and then the world is all this noise and excitement and action and pettiness and cruelty. And you would think that the response would be, oh, I'm going to just give all this love to all these really harsh people. And without the skillfulness and mindfulness to do that, at least what I found is that my reaction would be to just dish it right back out to them. And so my younger years were really dealing with a lot of anger. And now that I think back on it, now that I have hindsight, I go, I was probably angry because the world was so jarring in comparison to the tranquility I found in meditation. Which is why maybe both inside meditation, whatever kind of meditation you're doing, inside of that and outside of that, if you have that mindfulness sort of always there in the background, you can see these patterns arise. And that's that clarity we need to really change ourselves, to have that metamorphosis, that alchemical change the Buddha promises us. Now I think we're getting to verses 283, 284, and 285. With these ones, I wasn't really sure at first what the Buddha was talking about. So I did go to the commentaries, and so if you don't remember, to refresh your memories, this is when he's talking about cutting down the forest of lust, and having cut down the forest of lust and the underbrush of desire, be passionless, O monks. He even talks about the subtle desires of a man toward a woman, and so when we read that, especially in our society, our initial reaction is like, oh, he's talking about celibacy. He's talking about not having relationships. He's talking about moving away and just being a monk or a priest or something like that. And when we look at the commentaries, it turns out it's a little more nuanced than that. According to the commentaries of Buddhaghosa, there were 5 monks. Rather, they started out as 5 lay people, and they were friends. And as they got older, they became old men. They decided to become monks. And they had a habit of going and visiting their former wives for their alms rounds. And so they'd go around and collect the food and maybe chit-chat for a little bit, and they go on their way and everything. And they still had this touchstone to their former lives. And then the wife of one of those monks passed away suddenly. And all 5 monks were inconsolable. When the Buddha came across them, they were crying and lamenting, mostly the loss of her food, but also very sad that she'd passed away. And so that's when the Buddha said these verses to them. And so on the one hand, he's talking about simple non-attachment. You know, for on the one hand, they had become monks, and so they were still attached to their wives in these various ways, and then also attached to a loved one that had passed away. And if there's one thing that we know via impermanence, it's that we're all going to die. We're all going to pass away. And that doesn't mean that we should run away from relationships, you know. It simply means that we need to be prepared for what inevitably happens. And so we can still have friends, we can still have loved ones, we can still have spouses, which makes me happy. I'm married, my wife's over there. But there's a certain way we can look at desire, which I think is helpful. You know, desire is a tricky word. In fact, we even talked about desire a little bit last week when Chandana had his talk. And you know, desire can be dangerous. It can be dangerous because we can become attached so easily. But we can still have relationships because there are ways to be desireless, ways to be unattached that still have so much love and kindness and generosity and intimacy that might even be improved by removing greed and hatred and delusion, by removing those deep-rooted desires that make us so often so unskillful. And so that's the understanding I came to in those verses, where, you know, the Buddha says, look at our relationships. Look at them as the seasons. They come and go, but we should enjoy them while they last in skillful ways and then move on, right? Because life moves on whether we do, you know. And so that's what I saw there. He says in 285, cut off your affection in the manner of a man who plucks with his hand an autumn lotus. Cultivate only the path to peace, nibbana, as made known by the Exalted One. In this case, there was a student of Sariputta who was given the impurities of the body as a focus of meditation, and he just really couldn't get into it. It wasn't working for him. And so Sariputta sort of put his hands in the air and passed him along to the Buddha, who instead of having him focus on purities of the body, gave him instead this beautiful lotus to focus on. And so the young monk goes off into the forest, he looks at this beautiful lotus and just concentrates on it very deeply. And because of its beauty and because of its fragrance, he just zeroes in on that. And he gets to the fourth jhana very quickly, right? And in that moment, the lotus begins to wilt and shrivel, and it ages before his eyes. And it was then that he really understood, impermanence. These things don't last. Beauty itself doesn't last. And so he actually managed to find what he would have found if he'd looked at the impurities of the body. So, you know, these things that we see as permanent and beautiful are ephemeral. They're here and then gone. And so this ties in not only to how we see the world and its underlying reality, but again also how we apply mindfulness in our lives. You know, if we assume that things are going to last forever, then we don't have that sense of immediacy, that kind of head on fire that we see in other suttas. And then also too, we don't go past our own prejudices, our own views on how things should be. We don't find that unattachment, right? We're still attached to beautiful things. We have no grasp of our aversion, let's say. And so I'll begin to summarize in what I call section 5. These are verses 286, 287, 288, and then the final one, 289. And they all come down to the same concept of death and seasons and the timing of things. And so when the Buddha talks about, if we wait too long, we put our stock in this future that we assume is there, we never get around to practice. And so he brings up this, I think, a really powerful image. As a great flood carries away a sleeping village, so death seizes and carries away the man with a clinging mind. Flash floods are a thing definitely in California, and they can come like that, and then everything's gone, and that is itself life. We also see that in our own lives, this passing away of things. When I think about that, or at least when I thought about that in the past, I'd get nervous. I would get scared. I think I started in on the spiritual life because I was afraid of dying. Like, I think back to my first memories as a little kid, when my great grandfather passed away, and I was trying to wrap my head around what death might be. And this is before my parents decided to convert to Catholicism, so I didn't even have any concept of what death might be like. There was no concept of heaven, so I just assumed maybe you just don't exist anymore. And so I remember lying in a bed and just thinking, what it would be like to just not exist? Like, is it all black? Because that's still some kind of, and so that's a weird thought for, like, say, a 5-year-old to have, but I did have those thoughts. So we have to become comfortable with that reality, that there is an end to things. And also, too, that there's also a way out. The Buddha tells us that Nibbana, because it is unconditioned, because there's no birth there, because there's no rebirth there, there's no death there, it's the deathless. But again, we only get to there through this process that begins in the mind, that culminates in wisdom. The wisdom to see things as they actually are. And I think I'll end on that strong point. And I think if there are any questions, great. And if not, we can get to the fun chanting part.